All right. I want to say hello to everyone and welcome. It's a pleasure having you here today. My name is Sarah Muir, and I'm a director on the Planning Institute board. I've been invited to host you here today, so it's my pleasure to be here as a representative from the board and to welcome you. And I'll start with our land acknowledgement. So the Planning Institute of British Columbia recognizes, acknowledges, and appreciates that we are able to live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of BC and Yukon. I want to acknowledge and respect that we're gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, the Malahat, the Pachidat, the Chinyu, the Suk, the Swanik peoples, the Comox First Nation, and the Tla'amin First Nations, whose traditional and cultural processes and relationships with the land continue to this day. Acknowledging the principles of truth and reconciliation, we recognize and respect the history, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our lives, this region here across Vancouver Island, and our country. So, with that, I have the opportunity to share a few of the board's strategic priorities. But first, some smiling faces. This is our board, and again, it's a pleasure to be here today. The board has been working on our mission and values, and our statement for PIBC through the future is that we see this as a thriving organization supporting professional planners to manage change in support of resilient, connected, inclusive, and vibrant communities. The board's outlined 3 strategic priority areas. First being a pursuit of justice, equity, diversity, decolonization, and inclusion. The second priority is to enhance the value, engagement, and recruitment of our membership here in PIBC. And last, we aim to advance the profession. And with that, we've started the Peer Learning Network. So, as you may know, the province has partnered with PIBC to develop and implement the Peer Learning Network. And ultimately, we aim to support local government staff and colleagues across the province to share knowledge and case studies with regard to how new housing and the development about case studies with regard to new housing and the development approval legislation. I want to say how grateful I am for the hard work of our Executive Director, Dave Crosley, working with the esteemed Christine Agnello. They've launched the Peer Learning Network. I want to thank City Spaces. The team is here today. They've helped to develop today's agenda and will be facilitating today's session and keeping notes of the discussions today. In terms of the activities of the PLN to date, we had our very successful first PLN webinar, Ask a Lawyer, that was held February 23rd. The webinar's been recorded and it's available for viewing on the PLN webpage, which is on the PIBC website. So I'd encourage you to go and check that out if you haven't already. We hosted our first in-person session in Prince George for the North at the end of February. We have today's session. We'll be in Kelowna on Monday, March 25th. And then on March 28th, we'll be gathering in Vancouver for those folks in the Lower Mainland. We're also looking to host virtual sessions in the coming months tailored for and focused on regional districts and rural areas across the province. So we continue to build out the PLN webpage. So invite you to go and check out the important resources and materials there. We'll keep adding to it from the insight gained from these discussions, as well as partner institutes and other external organizations that are also embarking on this journey of new learning around the housing legislation. If you have any questions, we invite you to reach out to peerlearning@pibc.bc.ca. If you have questions, just send them along via email. And with that, I will pass it on to Janelle Dirksen, who, with City Spaces, who will introduce her team and the agenda for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, PIBC, for having us here today. My name is Janelle Dirksen. I'm a senior community planner with City Spaces Consulting. City Spaces is both a community planning and a development consulting firm based in Vancouver and Victoria. We primarily work with municipal and nonprofit clients to develop lasting, livable, and inclusive communities with an emphasis on social sustainability. Our role here today as facilitators is to create a safe space for dialogue. The goal of today is to create peer-to-peer learning opportunities in the regional context, also to network and learn from one another as we go through the legislative changes. Today there will be video recording, so if you turn your head, you can see at the back there's a camera there. That camera is facing this podium, so you will not be included in the video unless, of course, you stand up in front of the camera, so as an FYI. We'll be recording the presenters and the Q&A discussion with our panelists, but there will be no recording for the discussions afterward. If we can pop the agenda. So today we will have our presentations. We have 3 presenters today, 2 municipalities and 1 lawyer. We'll have a short Q&A, a health break, and then we'll go into breakout discussions. Finally, we'll have a group discussion with a few high-level details of what we talked about and close for the day. So with that, I will now introduce our first speaker. Chris Osborne. Chris Osborne is the Manager of Planning for the Municipality of North Cowichan. Chris has over 17 years of municipal experience in Canada and the UK, with time spent in both development planning and long-range planning. He holds a master's in planning from the London South Bank University, in addition to a master's in nuclear astrophysics from the University of Surrey. Let's welcome Chris.
When this event was first being conceived, there was a brief, very short-lived suggestion that it might be held further north on Vancouver Island, but apparently the Malahat was something of an insurmountable barrier. But when they subsequently put out the call for speakers, I saw an opportunity. Well, if we can't bring you to the North Island, perhaps we can bring the North Island to you. So I'm here on behalf of North Cowichan. I'm the planning manager there, so I'm sure most of you are generally aware of where North Cowichan is, but it's midway between Victoria and Nanaimo, bisected by the Trans-Canada. And it's often mistaken for a regional district because it has a large amount of rural areas and then 4 distinct urban centres within it, but it's all under one jurisdiction. So zooming in a bit more, the black line there is our urban containment boundary. So we've got Chemainus in the north, we've got Crofton kind of in the middle, and then sort of a messy northern part of Duncan and this archipelago of urban blobs all the way out to Maple Bay. And then in between that, a lot of infill in the form of farmland and municipal forest reserve. So I'm going to keep it very brief, or at least as brief as I know how, in order that there's plenty of time to hear from Andrea at North Saanich and Michael, who I suspect is probably going to be the star of the show as you all clamour to seek free legal advice, which I must admit I shamelessly did when we spoke about our presentations earlier this week, so I won't judge you too harshly for that. So I just want to cover 3 different aspects that we've been grappling with at North Cowichan. So the first is mapping and modelling the impacts of Bill 44, as I'll continue to call it colloquially. What our approach is in terms of meeting that June deadline that's bearing down on all of us with alarming speed, and some of the problem spots that we're grappling with, things we haven't quite figured out yet. So I'm going to kind of start at the end, and the reason for that is the timing of when the Bill 44 bomb landed in our midst was simultaneously unfortunate and serendipitous, because we just concluded a development economics exercise predicated on zoning uplift, which was kind of blown out the water by Bill 44. And then we were translating that into build-out modeling over a variety of timescales. Because we were midway through the modeling, we were able to pivot and in a fairly short space of time include Bill 44 impacts in that model. So this is an excerpt from the policy handbook. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Have a copy on your bedside stand. And Appendix E contains different methods for calculating build-out. And we've kind of used both. The trends assessment's the more simple one. It can be done in-house. Method 2 relies on BC assessment data. It's generally done by consulting firms, although it is possible, I think, to do a crude version of it in-house as well if you can't afford the consulting resources or can't access them. And I just want to show you a few visuals. I'm not going to talk about any numbers here, but picture says 1,000 words. So I kind of want to time evolve what build-out looks like with and without Bill 44 in our jurisdiction. So this is an excerpt from the south end of North Cowichan, city of Duncan at the bottom, and then our collection of quasi-urban areas around the top. Black, again, is the urban containment boundary. And what we're looking at here is a heat map of population density. So where you've got a dark purple, that's your highest population density, and palest is the least. Again, I'm not showing numbers, I just want to show a picture. So this is our present day base. So this, if you map what we have at the moment in terms of residential structures, this is what we get for our residential density. It aligns up with census data. And we then cast forward in time 30 years. And this was the exercise that we had pretty much wrapped up by the time Bill 44 landed. So not considering Bill 44, this is what our build-out looks like. So I'll just kind of toggle between them. So you can see, there's a reasonable amount of development that's taking place. And a lot of this was based on an in-house assessment. We know where our vacant sites are. We know where our significantly underdeveloped sites are. Able to take a reasonable stab at anticipating their redevelopment over a 30-year time period. So then what we did is we added in, okay, well now we've got to put Bill 44 on top of this. And you can see suddenly a whole load of extra density pops up. It's quite striking how diffuse that is. It's pretty evenly spread around the whole area. And of course that is the intent of Bill 44. It's doing what it should do. And this is also based on a realistic assessment of what kind of sites are developable in that 30-year period. So when, and the consultants who did this, they took the BC assessment data and sites that were a large parcel and a rather worn out box from the 1950s are flagged as pretty high prospects for being redeveloped in a 30-year time period. Anything that had a building permit for a new house within the last 5 years or so, pretty much no chance that that's going to be redeveloped. So that's what you're seeing there. And then at the insistence of our engineering director, we went all the way to build out. So taking the zoning at face value, what is the zoned capacity there? And although it is largely an academic exercise, utilities managers need to think on very long timeframes. They're putting in pipes in the ground of facilities that are designed to last 90 to 100 years. And they want to get it right. So with a long enough time, even marginally developable sites are likely to be developed, or buildings will burn down and be redeveloped. So this is our absolute zoned capacity, and now let's add in Bill 44, and then that's really striking in terms of what that does. So that is your sort of four units on every single urban lot. Again, not likely to be realized in any meaningful time frame, but 100 years is a meaningful time frame to an engineering director. Show you the same thing again, just in a different place and all on one page this time, so you can kind of see them together. So this is looking at Crofton within our jurisdiction. So there is today. Here's the population density increase as business as usual in 30 years. And then that's full build out in 90 years time. And then you add in Bill 44 to each of those scenarios. And you can really see quite a change there. And again, that's the idea. It's supposed to do that. But why that matters, of course, is for your infrastructure and servicing capacity. We really have to make quite long-term decisions when we're talking about infrastructure under the ground. Bill 44 does increase the uncertainty around that and how much build-out we will see. So I think we'll see estimates becoming more and more conservative to build in that wiggle room in case things really do take off. Allied to that is your development cost charges. Very important that DCC bylaws are brought up to date because you're leaving money on the table if you don't. And then we have our new ACC regime, which partially replaces the ability to negotiate changes through the zoning process. That ability still exists where a zoning is needed, but there's a whole bunch of sites now that will not need a zoning process. And then, of course, we have all of our environmental and social consequences of densifying our neighborhoods and making sure we've got sufficient park networks, pressures on environmentally sensitive systems, access to green space, et cetera, et cetera. So very important that we understand that. So I just wanted to show you that because I suspect we're probably a little, just because of the timing, a little further along in that aspect than most municipalities. And then coming to how we get there and meet the June deadline, I don't think we are any further along than anyone else. But I did want to talk a little bit about our approach here. Because I've heard a lot of discussion about what exactly is it that we can or should do by that June deadline. So we've kind of put it into 3 buckets here. So the things that we must do, there's not really any wiggle room on that. We have to get them through the gate by the end of June. And there's a whole load of stuff that we're advised that we ought to do, but it seems improbable that we're going to be able to address that, or at least address it in a satisfactory manner prior to June. So that's then slated for, we'll get working on that right away afterwards. And then all of the other stuff, the real fine-tuning, giving full effect to our official community plan, that's part of a longer program of zoning amendments. So that phase 1, it's all focused on legal compliance. We have a fairly clear statutory imperative, and it pertains to allowing that use and density of identifying your restricted zones and making sure that you are now zoning for the permitted density in all of those. That's pretty much all we've got time to do prior to June. We may identify, in terms of the site standards, if there's any really egregious things that are clearly going to inhibit that build-out, we can address them as well. But we are really looking to do the bare minimum to achieve legal compliance by the end of June. Phase 2 comes after June, and that's the optimization, and that's where we really get into the site standards. So we've got site standard packages provided to us by the province. We're also invited to consider going above and beyond the permissions that the legislation tells us to do. So that's thinking about things like outside of urban containment boundaries, you have to allow either a suite or an ADU, but you could allow either at the applicant's discretion, or you could allow both. So you've now got options in front of you. And the ever-present parking standards, it wouldn't be planning if I didn't mention parking at some point in the presentation, so let's just get that over with. But it was important to us not to fold these into phase 1, and the reason is that these, there are different options in how you do this, and the extent to which you do it is subject to disputation. And it's kind of shortchanging council and the public to hitch these to the coattails of the statutory changes that are charging towards an unmissable deadline, because it doesn't really leave adequate time to explore what the best options are for our community. So for that reason, we're holding off on doing those so that we can do them properly in short order after we've made the deadline with the stuff that we absolutely have to do. And then finally, because we were also in the midst of a wholesale zoning rewrite when this dropped, so these were things that we were looking to do anyway, is making sure our development permit guidelines are now up to snuff and reflective of the new reality, and then addressing our commercial industrial zones and other general regulations like home-based businesses. So that's our approach. And then the third part of the presentation is just some of the tricky corners that we've run into. And not to say that any of these things are insurmountable or that there aren't answers to them, but that they need thinking about. And it's not quite as straightforward as the handbook breezily invites us to believe. So one thing that we're struggling with is we've got a number of residential zones that exist inside and outside of our urban containment boundary, but we now have to accord them different density and use permissions within the same zone. And there isn't a particularly elegant way of doing that. You know, do we import a map of the urban containment boundary into our zoning bylaw? Do we have some clunky wording to differentiate verbally between an R3 site in one area as opposed to one in another? Or do we have to create a new zone or start painting different zones over these properties? We have to do this, but there's different ways that we can go about it. Still haven't really figured out which is going to be best. Commercial zones, this is another tricky one, and I think Michael is perhaps going to touch on this a bit in his presentation. So many commercial zones contain some limited residential permissions. So this is our general commercial zone, and it does allow for accessory dwelling unit and a mixed-use building. So does that make it a restricted zone? Probably not. The presence of a single-family dwelling there does, but it's complicated by the mixed-use building. We are a little bit concerned, too, of whether if it is a restricted zone and we now have to allow 3 or 4 residential units, could that be detrimental to the commercial intent of the zone? Is it going to now lead perhaps to the closure of some of those small corner stores where the residential potential of the lot is now much greater and perhaps much more lucrative than any of these commercial uses listed here? But we are told we mustn't be zoning away. We can't remove that residential permission, at least at face value we can't. So that's something we still haven't figured out too. The third one is in terms of growth areas. So what we're looking at here, this greenfield area is all inside of our urban containment boundary, and the large rectangular parcel in the top right is the site of a new hospital. So there's a local area plan for this whole area. So it is a growth centre and it is greenfield, so huge development potential. And the image there is taken from the LAP. It's the kind of residential development that is envisaged for a large part of this site. But we have a number of small lots in the area where if you allow 4 units on them, that could still be quite attractive to a lot owner as a rather quick and easy way of making the money. But of course that now compromises its longer term potential developability. So the intent is probably to try and not only maintain but impose a low-density zone in excess of 4,000 square meters. And really we just have to trust that if that's challenged, a court would agree that that is a reasonable exercise of the zoning powers, because of course the legislation tells us we can't unreasonably restrict the housing permissions that are granted by this. I would hope that they would realize that this is being done in the interests of providing even more housing and not some kind of way of subverting the intent of the legislation. Remains to be seen. And then finally, another one is something of a loophole we kind of identified is where you have a low-density multi-family zone. So this is our R6 zone. It's all, everything would make it a restricted zone apart from the townhouse permission, which is a multi-family typology. But if you look at the density for the townhouse, it's very low. So then you worry, well, is that something that could be abused? Could you add in a multi-family use to a single-family zone, but at a density that is pretty unattractive, and kind of dodge it that way? Not that we would want to do that, but it's unclear at the moment how that would be viewed, or indeed how we should amend it and in what way. And final thought before you're feeling too full of despair, and I often come back to this myself, is that you can't achieve perfection. The real world is messy, and as soon as you try and put some regulatory box around it, you're trying to capture sort of the 85–90% of scenarios, but there are always some absurd situations, some loopholes, some situations that should have been captured by the bylaw, and someone gets away with it. And then at the other side of things, you have Ma and Pa Kettle just trying to do the right thing, and then they get swamped in regulations or requirements. And that's unavoidable. And so we're also trying to counsel ourselves not to go too far down the rabbit hole of what ifs, because we're always going to find what ifs. We're always going to find a ludicrous situation somewhere. And rather than hunting all of those down, focus on the middle of the bell curve. Is what we're doing reasonable? Is that going to achieve the aim in most situations? So I'm going to leave it there and pass over to Andrea at Central Saanich. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now I'm going to welcome Andrea Pickard, Community Planner of the District of Central Saanich. After working in healthcare and on international development for more than a decade, Andrea returned to school in 2000, graduating from UNBC in 2005. After a short stint at the Regional District of Okanagan, Similkameen, working for the Regional Growth Strategy, she then worked at the City of Kamloops, gaining diverse experience. However, the draw of Vancouver Island remained strong, and she was happy to return in 2009 to work at the Islands Trust Victoria office. After 5 years at Islands Trust, she then worked at the District of Saanich for 4 years until moving up the peninsula to Central Saanich 6 years ago. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see a good turnout. How do I get this thing to advance? There we go. Thanks. And so just a quick overview of what I'm going to touch on today. First off, just where is Central Saanich? We quite often get asked a question like, is that Big Saanich or North Saanich? Or is that near the ferry? Just a little quick update on some of the recent planning projects we've been doing in the last few years, the current status of our bylaws and kind of processes, how we're viewing the impacts of Bill 44, and ways to look at it as potentially a blessing in disguise. Some of the land use analysis we've done early at this stage that helped us develop an overview, a zoning approach. And then that led to even more analysis, some draft zoning, and some hurdles ahead. So Central Saanich is wedged between Big Saanich, as it may often be called, and North Saanich. We are a really interesting municipality in the sense that we have a little bit of every planning activity you could ever do going on there, with two main village centers in Brentwood Bay and Saanich Village. We have the Keating industrial area and two shorelines. So it really is quite diverse. Similar to Chris's scenario, we do have, almost 2/3 of our district is in the ALR, so only 18% of our lands are actually within our urban containment area. And as you can see, they are spread all over the place. We also have 2 First Nations that are wholly situated within our jurisdictional boundaries, although obviously we don't govern any of their land use. And that results in a really odd-shaped urban containment boundary. So in the last few years, some of the projects we've done that have been really helpful to get us to here, and hopefully in the future discussions of Bill 44, have set us up really well. One was a residential infill and densification project we did, and this ran from about 2018 to 2021. It kind of started off with a housing needs and capacity report, but it led to us updating all of our OCP policies around housing and also adopted new regulations in our land use bylaw. What we really did at that time was support and encourage more diversity in our housing supply. We really were heavy on single-family dwellings. We put in policies that supported up to 8 units within neighborhood areas without needing to amend the OCP. We introduced a concept of main corridors, and on the map to the right, those kind of what looks like orange pieces of spaghetti in the roadways, those were what we identified as main corridor areas. So we didn't change the land use designation on the property, but we flagged the extent of areas where we wanted to see higher density than neighborhoods, but not to the level we would look for in our village centers. We also did adopt new infill development permit area for a range of infill typologies. That is, the type of development we see. And at that time, we allowed for cottages or carriage houses and did things like reduce the lot area requirements for duplexes. So we did make a number of regulatory changes, hoping to incentivize people to follow through. And we also, as a result of these policies and with some development applications, were able to get adopted an infill zone that allowed for a range from 3 to 8 dwelling units. So we just barely got that into our zoning framework recently. We also had updated, or I shouldn't say updated, created a new Saanich Village design plan. And the focus of that was really on the public realm aspects and road designs, but also did include land use designation. We had done an active transportation plan. Like many places, we had started delegating some things back in 2021, and we're kind of gradually introducing more delegation to council over the time period and hope to do more. And then in 2023, we just wrapped up an update to our OCP. So we were able to incorporate a lot of that work into our OCP. One of the things that was kind of unfortunate at the time, or may have been, and the OCP project got to the stage of having some new draft development permit guidelines, but council decided to sever them at that point, just to defer them to a future project to deal with mainly the policy aspect. It was kind of frustrating at the time, but at this point it set us up really well, because as soon as this zoning is done, then we're going to be back there with those revised DP guidelines and be able to incorporate a lot of the Bill 44 impacts. So in that sense, the timing has worked out well for us. So where we're at now is, we do have a land use bylaw that's been fairly established for a lot of years, but like most people, it's been altered over the years. Zones have been added. Some uses are in there with about 4 or 5 different names, and it's really just kind of morphed over time. We had allowed the cottages and carriage houses, so when we did that, we did do a lot of cleanup to the bylaw, but like many places, try not to go too crazy with it and to keep it manageable. We do have the DP processes, again, for a range of infill typologies, so everything from small lot to duplexes or to small scale townhouses. And one of the things we did at that time was introduce a maximum house size. Our zones had kind of become out of step with each other, so people were applying to the one zone that had the highest FAR, and it just wasn't making sense. So by bringing in house sizes, it kind of did help our zoning framework make a bit of sense, and we did try to make them as consistent as possible. Things like side yard setbacks, they just ranged from 3 to 6 meters in neighborhoods, and it made no sense. It just reflected the evolution of the bylaw in different time frames. What we have found is, since we did those amendments, again, that was about 2021, they were all done. We have had cottages and carriage houses built. The uptake has been higher in rural areas. They're not subject to a DP, but I also think they may be more affluent homeowners, and it's just a bit easier for them to accommodate. We have probably had about 6 detached accessory buildings built a year since then, but probably what we're finding is, although a lot of people are interested in them, when they talk to the contractors, they realize how costly they would be, so they really have become cost prohibitive. So looking forward, so when Bill 44 was announced, kind of looked at it, probably like most of us, after you get over the shock, thought, well, is this really a perfect opportunity for us to look at our zoning bylaw and largely throw out what we don't like? So I thought, this is really an opportunity to look at our entire zoning framework and think, how should this work in a way that's a little bit maybe more user-friendly for the public and easier for staff to administer and easier to interpret. So we kind of came up with an overview and approach that was basically removing all our residential zones or replacing them with 1 or 2, and presented that to council in January. Did not get into the details of it, but really just endorse it. This is what we were thinking. We also determined that if we're going to do this for our neighborhoods, it would make even better sense to do the same exercise with all of our higher density multifamily zones and our mixed use zones. So we kind of did say to council that as soon as we're done this, we want to follow up and amend those zones as well. An example that I'm sure many of you have as well is, we have some zones that are in the bylaw and, might apply to a handful of sites, but nobody would use them to develop under today. They just really reflect a development in the 70s or 80s. So, why do we still have those zones? So that is our hope, to carry on and do that work. In the end, we have 10 restricted zones that we need to deal with in Bill 44. That's roughly 3,700 lots, 3,800 lots. And at this point, we don't have any of the transit areas that do apply yet. But like many of you, BC Transit has told us, based on our local area plan, we can anticipate certain routes to hit that threshold in the coming years. So I will just mention, really our work is just on the Bill 44 because those areas don't apply to us. And outside of our urban area, we already do allow for suites, so the focus of our work really is that 3 to 4 unit requirement. So once we kind of started that, it was really starting to look at, okay, what do we need to figure out here to go forward? So one of the questions is really, how many different zones do we really need? How different are our neighborhoods, and what's the range of lot sizes we did? So there was some of that preliminary analysis. In the end, I would say it really doesn't show that there's a lot of distinction across our urban containment area, so we don't need a number of zones that we have. The other advantage of this was really the added benefit of assisting our engineering with analysis of the existing infrastructure capacity and identifying areas where additional growth pressure is really going to have the highest impact. So hopefully all of this information will feed into that process as well. But what we thought is how to bring in we do have quite a range of our lot sizes, even though on average they're very similar. So I thought instead of just having everybody be allowed 4 units, why not allow higher units on larger lots and get a better range of missing middle than just 4 plexes or 4 blocks, 4 unit townhouse blocks. So we kind of hoping to adopt a sliding scale approach. So larger lots would potentially have 6, 8, or even 10 or more units. At this point, we're probably thinking we'd put a cap on there of at 12 units being a maximum for this, but then you might be able to get some small multiplexes and just a bit more efficient townhouse developments. Allowing for higher density on larger lots will also reduce the incentive to create more lots and go through the subdivision process. Retaining larger sites will help improve site adaptive opportunities and tree retention and a number of other competing interests for our community. And we fully anticipate that strata subdivisions are going to be the predominant form of subdivision in the future, although there would still be some capacity for the creation of fee simple lots. So again, we do have this sliding scale approach, and that would be used to determine the number of units based on lot size. And similar to that, we would allow for incremental increases to the FAR and lot coverage based on the number of units proposed. Sorry, I missed slipping that slide ahead. So again, at this point, we're anticipating all of our residential zones would be replaced with one of 2. So the multi-unit neighborhood zone would be the largest one that would affect the vast majority of our neighborhoods. And I'm along those main travel corridors again, so on the properties adjacent to those orange spaghetti lines, there would be a similar multi-unit corridor zone. It would be framed up very similar to the neighborhood zone, but just with slightly higher density provisions. Both in the units, you could get them on smaller lots as well as the massing. And again, that would just align exactly with the main corridors that we already have identified in our OCP. So it's not too disruptive for the community. In the end, less than 10% of the properties actually fall within those corridor zones. And the corridor zone also, we are proposed to have a density bonus of 1 unit if you're creating a fully accessible unit. Like many of us, we're probably all dealing with parking regulations as well. We do have fairly high parking requirements now, especially when it comes to visitor. So we are getting that reviewed. At this point, we're tentatively thinking of going to something as just simply like 1 per unit. And see how it goes, and potentially a little bit lower standard on those corridor sites. But that's work we're still in the process of. So, once we kind of got to some draft zonings, of course, it's just been testing as much as possible. So part of that is looking at what is this housing potential, how's it gonna change things? Again, neighborhood by neighborhood analysis, with or without the travel corridors, and how many lots can have 4 units or 6 or 8. So the curve distribution on the right really does show that still 72% of our properties, they're still at 4 units. So even if we are allowing higher density on larger lots, it's not going to be really disruptive in the community because there's relatively few of them. And they're probably all in really good locations to suit higher density anyway. What's the geospatial distribution? So this is just a snapshot of a interactive PDF map where you can turn the layers on and off. So again, this is all being kind of set up to help us tell the story to council, because we know they're going to have concerns about this. So when this map is full out, you can turn the different layers on and off, so they will exactly be able to see which are the sites that can have 10 units, 8 units, 6 units, 3 units, etc. Also did a long spreadsheet kind of testing a whole bunch of numbers to see, can the parking fit? So, just roughly based on the lot area and the lot coverages, how much room is going to be left for parking, what's a parking standard stall, and according to the spreadsheet, seems to be able to work. What's the target density? How does this compare to our zones? Where are we getting at? And more and more and more. Basically, I've got way too many spreadsheets on the go right now. Every way we can look at this, we're going to try to look at it and break it down and just be prepared for all these questions from council. So got a ton of different spreadsheets on the go. Another thing we want to do, and we had done this when we did the infill study, worked with a company out of Edmonton that did some graphic works to test our zonings and help reflect to council and the community what it would actually look like. So these are a couple of their examples they did at that time, and we also had them do it on the neighborhood scale, and that is not a hypothetical neighborhood. We actually used a couple neighborhood examples, and they imported it in there. So these were realistic to the people living in those neighborhoods as what it could potentially look like. So we are going to have the same exercise done with this consulting company again, and to test a bunch of different scenarios, and then we'll be able to adjust our numbers accordingly. And again, have that available to help with the council conversations. Parking, again, as Chris mentioned, you can't get very far without it being a challenge. So we are going to have another consultant look at our parking standards and make some recommendations with their eyes mainly on SMUH legislation, but also large scale, because that's really what the developments we're getting, and reduce parking across the board. So that's some still work that we are rapidly trying to get done to make that June 30th deadline. So when it comes to our draft zone, so we did still retain a little max house size for lots if they're just going to retain a single family dwelling. As of yesterday, though, I was looking at that again, and we might be able to delete that, because with the scaling FAR, we might, it might become redundant, but we've kind of got it in there as a safety catch for now. Another regulation we're thinking is to limit the number of residential buildings on a property, and that's really to encourage the attached forms. Our society still likes their single-family homes detached, and what we want to make sure is that people just don't take a lot and put 4 small houses on it. We really want to try to get them to do the townhouses, the small plexes. We're also introducing a new regulation for us to have a minimum lot coverage percentage for soft landscaping, and that would not include things like permeable pavers. It truly is to retain vegetation. We're going to list the permitted typologies. And one thing we are going to differentiate between neighborhoods and corridors is retain single-family dwelling in neighborhoods, so that we're not creating a multitude of non-conforming lots, and it would allow people to retain and maintain them, but not on corridors. So along those corridors, we do want to see that transition away from retaining any single-family dwellings. And we have a range of zones, but we're kind of picking on our high end, minimum lot area of 750 square meters. Our lot sizes tend to be a little bit larger than that, although our zoning ranges from 300 to 800 currently. And again, that would still allow for some subdivisions, but not really support the creation of more small infill lots, because we have a number of lots under the 300, 280 square meters. So this is just a bit of a snapshot of what the zoning is kind of looking out to kind of show. So again, we broke it down by small, medium, or large lot sizes, how many dwellings you can have. And once it gets to the larger lots, above 1,000 square meters in our world, that's when it just kind of scales up. And then the FAR and the lot coverage would kind of go along with that. So we introduced this after, so having the 1 to 2 units being a lot less, which really reflects what our current zoning regulations are now. This is where we're thinking we might not, in the end, need that maximum house size. But that's kind of how our zoning is shaping up at this point. So looking ahead, so of course there's a lot of analysis, and we're trying to find every weak point we can and think of every question. So I just don't think I can do enough of it. And that in part is to really get council to accept and understand this. it's a lot of information for them to go through. So at this point, we're thinking it's probably going to need a dedicated special meeting to work through and really explain the analysis and our recommendations, and that a lot of the questions they're going to have really are contingent on an extensive amount of future work, things like amenities and the servicing. So ultimately, there's going to be a level of uncertainty that councils and the community is going to have to accept, that we're going to have to accept, because of course we don't have time to work through everything. But we'll just revisit it in the future and amend as needed. So I think, it's just that reassurance that just because we're done by June 30th doesn't mean we're ever done fixing our bylaws. And that the uptake is expected to be gradual. So hopefully that will help us there. From a political side, and this is some of the experience since we introduced this to council and subsequent meetings, a lot of confusion around the public hearings, no public hearings, when can we have them, how do we meet, how do we hear from the public, engagement, we don't have a lot of time. Council, I would say they're quite frustrated to a point, not so much about the push for housing, but the top-down process and less opportunities for public input. And this is kind of making them quite uncomfortable, is the sense we're getting. We also don't know what other legislative changes are going to come on the heels of this. So, if there's more to come, will that frustrate council even farther? And one thing I'd be interested to hear from this group, but one thing I'm just generally concerned about is really a lack of champions talking about this out there in the public sphere. The province announced it, and it's almost been radio silent in construction groups or UDI, or I'm not hearing people out there supporting it. So if council is only hearing from a bunch of neighbors and citizens that are really concerned about this, how hard is this conversation going to be for them to have? So that's basically all I was going to present on today. And yeah, really want to thank PIBC for pulling this together. It's always great to learn from other people where my mistakes were, and I look forward to some interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And for our final speaker, we have Michael Moll, who's a partner at Civic Legal. He has over 15 years of experience advising and representing local governments. He maintains a mixed practice of both litigation and solicitor work, with a particular focus on land use development, local government finance, and bylaw regulation and enforcement. We're really happy you're here. Welcome, Michael.
So for those of you who don't know Civic Legal, we're a full-serve municipal law firm. We are mostly focused on, our primary focus is on large-scale developments within municipalities as well as large construction sites, but we do the full spectrum of municipal law. And personally, in the planning side, I cut my teeth on the enforcement aspect. So it wasn't drafting the bylaws in the first place, it was dealing with the corner cases that Chris showed where someone built someone and it's like, hey, that shouldn't be allowed. And I was trying to explain to the court why it wasn't. Usually worked, but not always. So for this presentation, I was given a few questions that I understand some of you might be asking. Some of you may have already been answered, to have them answered and be happy with those ones. But I thought questions would be a good way to sort of just focus on the little points that come up with this legislation. And also, I feel you get a better answer if I have the question in advance, especially with a camera running. I can have the legislation I'm thinking of at hand, or at least I can pull the case at mind. So I realize there's going to be more questions. The quality of my answers will probably go down, so I'm just warning that now. So question number one, accessory dwelling unit. So the question is, many commercial zones permit an accessory dwelling unit, and in this context, an accessory dwelling unit could assume the form of a single-family dwelling, although it must be ancillary to a commercial use. Does this make the zone a restricted zone under the new Bill 44 amendments? So there's a lot of words there. I'm not sure people at the back can even read them. In here is the word no. That's the Michael Moll answer. And that's my view. And it's in part because the definition of restricted zone is a zone in which in respect of which the permitted residential use would, but for this section, be restricted to detached single-family dwellings. And before I get to my point, the policy manual, I think, implies that an accessory or ancillary dwelling isn't caught. On page 15, look at the first bullet point. But the reason I think it's not captured is a single-family dwelling use is, in this language, I would see it as the principal use. That you are allowed to have just your single-family dwelling on this property and no other use. And to describe a ancillary use is to say, no, you might get something that looks like a dwelling, but that has to be in conjunction with the primary use. So a hypothetical example would be a zone that permits a golf course with accessory caretaker dwelling. And that may look like a house, but for me, from the enforcement perspective, when that golf course closes and the fields become fallow, we would say, well, the caretaker's house has to go too. That use is only permitted where there's the presence of the primary use, in this case, the golf course. Maybe the drafters of the legislation, although I don't think they did, would say, well, if you can fit one house, the caretaker for the golf course, surely you could fit 3 or 4 more. And that might have a bit of an appeal, but from my view, if it's just ancillary and it's contingent on the primary non-residential use, it's not a restricted zone. And I'll point to some more legislative examples in response to the next questions, which is, where a commercial zone is deemed a restricted zone by reason of permitting a single-family dwelling as a principal use, would it be forbidden now to remove the residential use from these non-residential zones? Again, page 15 being the site in the policy manual. And more generally, is there now a prohibition on any zoning away from an existing residential use, even if a parcel lies within a commercial or industrial OCP designation? So I think Chris had an example of a zone that really looked commercial. It was a large number of commercial uses, but in there was a single-family dwelling use as a permitted use. So hiding in the words is my answer. Yes, it is a restricted zone. You're kind of stuck accommodating the minimum statutorily required numbers of units now. And that is despite the fact that the policy says it is not intended to apply to non-residential zones like agricultural, commercial, and industrial zones. I read that, it says it's not intended, but I have personally not found the words that make me confident that it comes out of that. And who knows, maybe that will change. And the reason I do that is because there was an option prior, historically, for the council that when you had your main street, say, and there were single-family dwellings on the main street, but you wanted it to be a true commercial zone, they could have rezoned it commercial and left the single-family dwellings as lawfully non-conforming. And had they done that, that old house on Main Street wouldn't be caught in a restricted zone, it'd just be a commercial zone. But there was a decision by council to say, well, no, we're going to leave that house as a permitted use. And that decision, how could they predict this would happen? I think keeps them in restricted zone. And the more complicated question, which you will not get an answer recorded for you, is what if we just sort of took those out and said, well, really, it's Main Street. It was never the single-family or duplex zone that this new legislation was intended to cover. I will note that, and this covers both questions, that different language was used in relation to the transit-oriented areas, which I'm not really covering with our questions. And the first is that they use the words any residential use. So now that captures ancillary. So that's the first thing the legislation does there. And then the regulation governing transit-oriented areas takes out, it says it doesn't apply to residential use that is ancillary or secondary to an industrial or agricultural use permitted by zoning bylaw. So they've identified two types that don't get caught now through an exemption, but institutional use or commercial use, if there's a ancillary residential use in a transit-oriented zone, then they would take that as saying the council has already identified this as an area that a residential use of some sort is, expected. Now you get your very high transit-oriented area zoning through legislation. The third question is, if a minimum subdivision parcel size of, I'll just say 1 acre, is imposed within an OCP higher density growth area in order to preserve the potential of parcels to deliver significant multi-family units through future rezoning, rather than have their build-out potentially squandered with 4 as-of-right units, how likely could this be deemed an unreasonable exercise of zoning powers? Now, I took this question. The answer that you won't read there is yes, no, maybe, which is again not very helpful, but let me explain. So the Local Government Act Section 481.4 sets out 2 important exemptions to the 3 to 6 rule, as I call it. And the first is that the requirement to impose a minimum dwelling unit doesn't apply to land within a zone in respect of which the minimum lot size that may be created by subdivision is 1 acre. And that doesn't matter what's actually there. The zoning bylaw has already said, no, these should be large lots. Maybe there are some smaller lots in there, in that zone, but council prior to this Bill 44 had already identified this as a place where a larger lot is appropriate. Now, is that because they want holding zones for denser uses, or is that because this is a very genteel acreage area of a community where you wanted big lots and there's just 1 or 2 smaller lots? But in any event, they should be out. What's also out from the mandatory minimums of 3 to 6 is a parcel of land that is larger than 1 acre. So it may be allowed to be, under the current zoning, subdivided into small lots, and those small lots may also be allowed to have single-family residential use or other residential uses. But because that particular parcel is so large, you don't have to impose the mandatory minimum at this time. So in that case, when you're redoing your bylaws, you might be saying, let's potentially move that out of the low, it's not that low anymore, but the SMUH density, let's move that to a much higher multifamily density use. And then the owners of that large lot is kind of steered towards the holding zone use. And that idea of making large lots not be squandered away in smaller fourplexes or maybe sixplexes, what is I see reflected in the transit-oriented legislation, where it's sort of, it looks like you're outside the SMUH rules, but really the idea is to get you into the much higher density. So covenants, just a quick aside, I think for a couple of years I pitched to PIBC to speak about the interplay between covenants and zoning at the annual conference, and I never got picked. And now I realize why, because you have this giant policy manual and they just skim over covenants in 1 page. And so obviously people don't think it's as exciting as I do, but I consider it a very complicated issue, and I have to say that planners, I think, create those complicated issues. But hooray for the policy manual for just saying covenants apply. So that's great, but the policy manual also says, well, we're not going to expect you to have future covenants that say, this use is, the owner has to essentially covenant that they will not build a secondary suite on their property, or they will not convert the house to a duplex, because why would you make them say that when they're allowed to build under the new zoning? But that doesn't quite answer the question is, well, what happens if I'm an owner and under the old regime I've built and I've agreed to that covenant saying I will not convert my house into a duplex despite my house being sort of spread out across a breezeway and a really good spot for a kitchen and the second, what I call the bedroom. And, it's how do I get rid of that covenant? And the legal way is that the owner, well, first off, you ask, can I get rid of it? And hopefully, for the owner, from the owner's perspective, council will say yes. Now, that was a vestigial of our old low-density days. Of course, we want you to have your second dwelling unit on your property. But if they don't get that answer, they can apply to the court under Section 35 of the Property Law Act and say, well, I think the covenant is obsolete. It has to be changed or removed. And so the most recent pre-Bill 44 example of this is one called Natura Developments on Ladysmith, and it happened in 2015, and there was an application to get out of a restrictive covenant. That wasn't just limited to number of units, it also had a bit of language about how the plan of those units. But in short, the covenant said no more than 15 units, and the zoning happened to say 29. So the owner, I think quite fairly says, why are you holding me down at 15? Why can't I be at 29? And the court, a little bit surprisingly to me, said, well, the zoning doesn't relate to an agreement that the covenant is no longer important. And that is because the Property Law Act is generally focused on private agreements where if your neighbor's like, I don't really care about this right over my neighboring property anymore, then the neighbor can say, well, then they've pretty much agreed it doesn't matter anymore. Here, you might say, well, why is council so concerned about there not being no more than 15 units when they're allowing 29? And court ignored that, and then it looked at the other characteristics in applying the test for obsolescence, and found that there were other aspects, other goals within the restrictive covenant that should survive. And that's what the policy manual is thinking about. They're thinking about what site conditions not being suitable for higher density, maybe other other rules about interference with neighboring properties that are very site-specific. But I think I've seen a few covenants where I think they're only there as a way of telling the builder and the future owner, this is the zoning. It's really a means of registering zoning. And if that's the question, if that's the purpose, then the question is a council going to stick to that or recognize that maybe that's no longer important? And if they are going to say, no, that covenant has to stay, how far can the owner get by going to court? So that's what I foresee on those particular covenants, the zoning type. Site standards. So this is referring to sort of height, density, layout of properties. The question is, while we must take the policy manual and site standards into consideration, there's no legal requirement to adopt the site standards packages. If a local government adjusts its density provisions as per the Act, but made no further changes to the standards, presumably it would be for a future legal challenge by a third party to have the court determine whether maintaining the existing standards does or does not fall foul of the applicable section. So that's probably too small to read, but the first question is, the requirement is, actually not in that, is that you have to rezone in a way that's necessary to accommodate at least prescribed number of dwelling units. And without looking at any particular bylaw, if you can allow a single family dwelling, I think the market has proven you can convert that to 4, even 6 units. Those units may not be very nice, they may not be building code compliant, but there are ways to increase that density. So from a starting point, if you just said single family dwelling now equals quadplex to get your minimum 4, someone could build something, I expect. But if they can't, then I don't think that's a reasonable application within the requirement under Section 571, And the remedy, the first remedy is the minister sends a direction and says, you need to fix this. You say you're allowing 4, but they can't build 4 safely and on the parcel. And if you don't fix that, then it's there's interim provincial regulation, which is essentially the province zones it. And that's not just the units. I guess there's adjusting your site setbacks or your height or whatever you've done to, in combination to prevent the development. So that's a remedy. And then I guess the owner could also apply to a court for a remedy saying it, on its face, it looks like you're permitting 4, but when you read all the regulations, we can't fit 4. I think the greater risk is that what's permitted to be built is just not what anyone wants. Like not just the owners, but the neighbors, and you're really not serving anyone by not doing that. But I understand from the earlier presentations, it might be easiest to start with just getting the minimums in, identifying where they go, and then taking a bit more time to get the site standards in a way that over the long run provides better development. So final question, subdivision and development standards, another topic dear to my heart. I edited that chapter of the CLE guide for a few years. Can a municipality require land dedication at the time of BP if the right-of-way does not have the width required based on road classification? And in this context, right-of-way refers to the dedicated highway. So my answer is no, but it's not up there. So dedication is likely only obtainable at time of subdivision. So if a SMUH density, 4 to 6, required a wider highway than a single-family dwelling, the time to have gotten that was at the subdivision of the larger development, but obviously no one knew this was coming. So now you're stuck with this in many cases, slightly narrower road for the higher density property. There are provisions that talk about when you develop what you have to build on the highway in front of your parcel, as well as the standards on your parcel. Those still apply, but they don't. In my view, doesn't include the obligation to dedicate to shrink your parcel even further. How I'd view it is that what used to be your state standards for a single-family dwelling should now be your SMUH level. And it may be that you bring your standards down to the point at which it's still functional, but it's like the owners aren't having to build quite as much as you would have previously asked at a higher density, or maybe it's a slow move up. But that's probably the biggest issue that's not quite covered here, is that before, when developing, a lot could be put on the developers to say, look, you need to upgrade not just for your dwellings, but for the extended services, increased services. You need to bring us up to the standard we need to be to accommodate this density. Now it's like, oh, well, everyone's got higher density as of right. The community, the local government, they have to raise the money in part through DCCs, but a lot through just general taxes to pay for the upgrades needed to accommodate higher demands on water, sewer, roadway, and so forth. So that's sort of the perspectival change I'm seeing from that. So those are, I'm just asking for more questions, glutton for punishment, but I think I'm supposed to sit down and see what are asked. Is that, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to all of our presenters. So we have about 5 minutes for a short Q&A. Please keep your questions specific to the presentations, because after our break, we're going to dive in and have a discussion about all the different legislation pieces. So if you look behind you, Kevin, give a big wave. He's got a mic, so please raise your hand and he can come around to you and you can ask your question.
It's on? Yeah, it's on. Questions for Michael. I'll frame it somewhat simplistically. Who do you think would win between a Bearland Strata property owner that wants to do 3 units and the Strata Council? Obviously,
So they want to do 3 units within their strata parcel. Just to confirm, the question is they have a single strata parcel in the Bearland strata, and they want to increase that density. Can I just want to answer that? The answer I want is, well, who does the municipality want, the council want to win? Because the best way, in my view, from dealing with strata is you go backwards and say, what if this was just a single lot and everyone got along? What would be the permitted density there? And I think they would be able to claim they're entitled to that under the new one. And so the local government's best argument is, well, we unwind the strata, they're already at a statutory minimum density, there's no more to be had. But if there is more to be had, who gets it within a strata lot is the question you didn't ask, but another complication, which is, it's just, yeah.
the other question is, does a Strata Council hold municipal
Oh.
Can they restrict the level of density with
I direct you to an article in Young Anderson back from when I was there on the smallest, one of the newsletters I wrote on how there's the huge distinction between strata council, essentially land use powers, and local governments, and they're not bound by lawful non-conforming, and they actually have a lot more teeth in terms of forcing people to do and not do things than I think most people realize. So if the strata says no, that gets you a long way, I would say.
Does the regulation not imply, though, fee simple lot for SMUH?
Well, that's, yeah, so the question is, does the regulation not apply a fee simple lot? And that was where I was trying to go, is that if you just imagine the strata, Bearland strata wasn't there, you would, that it would be the way to look at it. But I think the issue is, if you had that fee simple lot, like if they unwound the strata, hypothetically, and just all agreed to be on the land together, what would they be allowed to have? And is that, if that's higher than what they have now, then now you got this question is, how do we allow that density, and then how is that distributed? And this is getting deep in the weeds, but could they unwind their strata, develop and re-stratify at a higher density? And if they could, what are we going to do when they just want to try and get it the other way? So, very complicated question. That's why mine were all easy.
Thank you. My question would be for anyone that can answer it. It relates to the SSMUH regulation and the proximity to transit and frequent transit services unlocking additional density. There was an FAQ document that came out, I think, this week from the province, and it suggested that local governments would be required to update their zoning in response to changes in transit frequency and service levels. I'm just kind of curious, like, are we now then entering into a world where transit agencies, in essence, are going to start getting some control over land uses? Because ultimately, I actually used to be a transit planner, and I don't recall having to get council approval to change service levels on any particular route. So the transit agency could be also saying, hey, we would like to have a role in shaping land use to support transit services, and I'm just curious how that might play out with transit agencies versus local government having influence over where future SSMUH areas could be, or alternatively pulling transit services perhaps off of routes where they don't want to see, 6 versus 4 units.
Very quick answer from the North Cowichan is, can you explain what this transit thing is that you're talking about? Other than that, I'll pass over to Michael.
This is the wrong forum to talk about delegation of government because we have a province saying, well, we'll set some rules at the very top end. You know, I see lots of issues arising from that. I think the biggest one is that you're going to have people lobbying directly the transit authority not to put a bus stop out front of their house or not to upgrade this. Well, the developer side might want that, but I don't know. Who tends to be the loudest is usually the NIMBYs. But yes, now you have I guess regional, pseudo-provincial, in the case of BC Transit level of government, that it matters. And from an administrative law perspective, that not shocking. Like the province, the regional transit authorities, and the local governments all have an interest in housing and transit, but the distribution of the levers is now changing, it looks like. We've got a better answer coming. I've forgotten the question, so. But Andrea's got some.
I don't have an answer, but I think a flip question on that is what happens if they have meet the frequency service now or in the future and then they change the route. So do you then go back and say we can require parking? So I think they've opened a can of worms that they don't have an answer to yet.
Thank you for the questions and thank you for the answers. We are going to take a break. I don't want to take your break away, so please come back at 1:30. And the next portion of our time together is all about discussions. So come on back. The washrooms are out into the hall the way you came, and there's a sign indicating where they are. So see you back at 1:30.